thought this was a talk about playgrounds.
Not really.
Designing play that matters, I guess.
It's not.
Sorry. Anyway, I'm David Lubrow, Executive Director of the Rappaport Institute, which, along with the Radcliffe Institute and Office of Career Services, is co-sponsoring tonight's talk. This is work that I first came upon this fall when we were putting together a conference on reimagining the city-university connection, and several people said, if you're thinking about new ways that people are connecting with cities and universities, you got to look at Eric Gordon's work here. He's kind of be one of our lunch table speakers. And I had the good fortune of sitting at the table, and when Eric was able to get a word in edgewise, there were some lively people. I was just fascinated. Decided I wanted to learn more. And the way I do that is I have to make the right to schedule events. Eric Gordon is a faculty member at Emerson, and you also have a connection with Tufts that I could never quite understand.
I'm affiliated with the Tisch School.
And if anybody can explain the Tisch School. Sorry.
Community Service and Civic Engagement.
Actually, Tisch is a very, very interesting school at Tufts. University City Connections. And Eric is going to talk with us for about 20-25 minutes about something called Community PlanIt, which is a sort of online gaming platform for planning. And it follows some other work that he has done. Some of you may know Virtual Chinatown. Really good project there did a couple years ago. And he's going to describe some work he did with the Boston Public Schools. Carl Allen, now the transportation coordinator for Boston Public Schools, and Chris Osgood, our good friend from the Mayor's Office of Mechanics. We'll sort of illuminate some more of that conversation. We'll have a conversation. We'll be out of here probably no later than a quarter to 8. Great. Thank you for joining us.
Yeah, thank you. All right, so David asked me to speak about Community PlanIt, which is what I'm going to talk about, and hopefully open up some issues about using digital media in a kind of public sector environment. And specifically, I want to talk a little bit about game dynamics and how those might apply to the context of planning. And of course, we're going to talk about some of the possibilities and challenges of working with a large city school district. So the first thing is to set up the problem, why we did this. The problem is essentially a lack of participation. Community PlanIt is not so much a planning tool as it is an engagement tool. And what I mean by that is that through the course of planning, we try, the challenge is to use planning as a situation, as a context for engaging people in communities and making for stronger communities through dialogue and learning. So lack of participation, meetings are inconvenient for many people. And so one of the foundations of the public process, of course, is the public meeting, which typically takes place at 6 o'clock on a Tuesday evening, not the most convenient time for people to come out and share their ideas. And so, so just on a fundamental level, we have some barriers in place. And there are always barriers in place, and there are barriers with technology as well, which we'll talk about. But the meeting structure has some inherent barriers. Large meetings are also intimidating. Going to a meeting, especially when if English isn't your first language, if there are cultural barriers, even if there aren't, going to a large meeting and expressing your opinion about local affairs is not necessarily the most comfortable situation. So here we have another problem that can be addressed, and technology, and specifically online and network technologies, pose some really interesting potential solutions. There are limited learning opportunities in these meeting contexts as well. Typically, meetings are meant to as a form of communicating typically in a one-way form of sort of downloading information to a public and then getting the public to respond, hopefully in meaningful ways, but it doesn't provide much opportunity for learning. So you typically have 2 hours to engage mostly spent in a room like this with someone like me talking for a long time, and then people, you know, talking a little bit, putting stickers on boards, whatever it might be. But the actual interaction is not maximized to its potential. So again, not ideal for teaching about issues. And so if the point of planning meetings of any sort is to teach to an extent, and it has to be, and in most cases we don't acknowledge that actually, that planning is about teaching. But if the point is to teach and then provide an opportunity for people to learn and share, then we're missing the mark. Which is this next one. Little opportunity for community to share and learn. Okay, so this is the problem, and Community PlanIt is built around trying to solve some of those issues, providing a more meaningful context, a more meaningful platform for people to engage. So a solution. So Community PlanIt is, as I said, a local engagement game, and it's designed to enhance participation and create a meaningful record. One of the other things that's often lost in a community process is any kind of archive or record of that community process. And one of the affordances of online tools is, of course, the possibility of creating an archive not only for the planners but for the community themselves as a record of that participation. And sort of an ongoing record that actually creates the information infrastructure of a neighborhood or of a city or of a school district, whatever it might be. So let me say a little bit about Community PlanIt. So there are lots of things online. This is not a brand new idea, of course, to build things online. Virtual town halls exist. There are lots of things that are available. Community PlanIt, we took a different approach, which was we wanted to connect the sort of face-to-face meeting, the affordances of the face-to-face meeting with the affordances of online connections. We also wanted to take that 2 hours that you usually have to connect with people, and we wanted to expand that over time. The problem with just infinitely expanding it over time is if you ask people to join in yet another local neighborhood network, people are network fatigued, and it's not necessarily the best approach just to say, here's something else for you to talk with, right? It needs to be directed, needs to be structured, or what we call curated, like any conversation. And so the software Community PlanIt is specifically built around that concept. It's mission-based, and so getting into some of the game dynamics and why games were important for our conceptualization of this, it's mission-based, where the goal is to collaboratively plan for the future. So, and what I mean by mission-based is that it's time delimited. So in the sense that in Community PlanIt, there are missions that have themes, and over the course of the mission, the community discusses, learns, shares, creates around a particular theme. Then that theme or that mission ends and something else starts. So when you sign up for this thing, you know exactly what you're getting into. It's very directed, it's very focused. The conversation is very curated, and it doesn't feel like you get into that kind of feature creep that you get with involving yourself in any kind of new network. Players earn tokens that they contribute to a bank of values. So in the slightly confusing piece here is that we've just done a radical redesign of the software. So I'm going to talk about the old version, I'm going to show you the new version, so try to keep that straight. But in both versions, players earn something like tokens that contribute to a bank of value. So essentially, what happens is you earn points by participating, and then what happened in the old version is that every time you earned 100 points, you earned a token. And then that token was then you were able to spend that token in what we call the token depot. And essentially the token depot was a way of, it was a kind of voting, but you were able to essentially allocate your resources that you earned during the game towards the value that you found most important. And it's not a one-to-one correspondence, one person, one vote, but the more you participate, the more you theoretically learn, the more you're able to contribute to the system. So, you know, we tried something that was potentially unequal in its distribution, but surprisingly, and I'll talk about that a little bit later, surprisingly, there wasn't I mean, that actually worked out quite well, and we can talk about that a little later. So again, players compete for points, so there's competition involved in the collaborative process of planning for the future. Players compete for points both individually and within affiliations. So players can pool their points with affiliations within the game, and that affiliation, they can make their own affiliations. So those affiliations can be neighborhoods, churches, schools, whatever affiliations they want. And it allows, actually, the affiliations became really important, especially for the young people playing, because it allowed them to compete. We had a pretty major competition happening between high schools in Boston when we implemented it in the Boston Public Schools. And then conversation is directed over the course of, and I'm talking about the Boston Public School implementation, over the course of 35 days. And then it includes face-to-face debriefing at the end. And so a lot of the literature on games says really clearly that learning in games doesn't necessarily happen through the immediate experience of playing the game, but often in the debriefing after playing the game. So it's really important to have that opportunity for people to talk about the experience of playing the game, getting those experiences out there, especially in the serious game context where you want the learning function of the game to extend to a community process or extend to a process outside of the game world, which is what we wanted to do, of course. All right, so let me talk more about games and what I think, again, the affordances of games are. All planning is a game, really. And planning games create an awareness of rules. So if you think about any process that you participate in as game-like, in the sense that there are rules and strictures, and participating in many ways is a strategy game. With the possibility of building a game around a system that's already game-like allows for the creation of, it allows the player to be more aware of rules and systems. And so a lot of game scholars call this systems literacy, essentially, and this is used beyond game scholarship. But the concept of systems literacy, games are quite good at achieving. If you think about playing any game, like here I have Monopoly, the narrative of Monopoly is pretty boring, really. And what's the fun part or the engaging part of the Monopoly is the rules that you're bound to. And you follow those rules, and you're quite aware of those rules, unlike other kinds of engagement with content, that you're not necessarily aware of the rules, but it's more of a transparent consumption of content. And so games allow players or users to actually experience the rules in question in the best case scenario, what those rules are. And play is, of course, important for learning, as it enables a kind of constructivist approach to content. So even within the content, the idea of play, and this is outside of game logic and game structure, being able to play with content is something that we want. We want, the idea that especially when people are planning, that it's not just about, again, information download, but it's about being able to have that content and being playful with that content in a constructivist sense. And I wrote the Nito factor, and actually this is a really important piece of this. In all cases, when you say there's anything like a game, and this is specifically true in the previous project that David mentioned that I did called Participatory Chinatown, which was a 3D game and much more game-like in its, or appeared much more like a game when you first saw it. The Nito factor was really important. It got people interested in it. When you said, oh, there's a game about your narrative, or I'm sorry, a game about your neighborhood, people were quite interested in that alone. So the Nito factor was actually a really important way of recruiting people into the process, and for Community PlanIt, it was the same thing. The negative side is that games are, the perception of games is that they're not serious, and planning is serious work, and it must be both serious, boring, and painful in order for it to be meaningful. And so anytime you propose something that's gamey or game-like or God forbid fun, then it can't have the serious effects of a planning process. So that's really an interesting thing, that perception barrier. That in every partner that I've worked with, from the school district to city governments, there is a concern that the public will see it in a way that doesn't correspond with the seriousness of the work that's being done. All right, so let's talk a bit about what we did in the Boston Public Schools. Really, and I'm going to let Carl, who's going to speak in a little bit, talk more about this, hopefully. But we invited participation around what we call the School Performance Index. And the school performance index was, simply put, it was a way of evaluating the quality of schools. And it was something that the school district created with some input from the public. And the district wanted to get public feedback and input on this index that they had created. So we built the game around that concept. And we used that as a way of structuring the game, in fact. We created 7 missions. Each mission lasted for 5 days, so a total of 35 days. And this was from September 15th to October 20th of last year. The game the content was created in 3 languages, English, Spanish, and Haitian Creole. The platform enables the ability to translate the game content into as many languages as you want, so it's manually translated, not machine translated. And we had over 400 players with over 4,600 comments. And so we get into a problem of both, that's not enough players, but it was also too many players in the sense of how do you make meaningful sense of all of that data, a huge amount of data that we got over the course of this 35 days. Just to give you some sense, I'm going to show you some. This is what the game looked like. Essentially, each mission essentially was broken up into multiple activities, and they were questions that asked you to map things or answer things from somebody else's perspective. And so there were different kinds of questions, essentially, that you would get points for, or you could create your own questions that we call challenges within the system. And so we got some interesting feedback all along the way, and I'm just going to throw this in there and just to give you some sense. One of the players said it was just the ability to voice an opinion that you wouldn't necessarily have a chance to do in a formal setting. So we're getting people expressing the sentiments that there was something about the process of not being, or sort of the idea of not being in a community meeting where you're forced to come up with these sort of coherent thoughts on the fly. Being able to type something into a system was actually really useful for a lot of the players. Someone else said the advantage of Community PlanIt, and this is why I'm loving it, as far as a communication tool goes, it's accessible anytime. So we're seeing, again, this sort of repeated idea that really what was really important to people about this whole process was the fact that it was available whenever. And we actually saw an uptick it was interesting because we saw a lot of use around, after the kids went to bed. So essentially around 9 o'clock into midnight hour or so is when most of the use took place, especially amongst the parents. Students around 3 o'clock and 5 o'clock was the big time. All right, so the other, again, every mission had a video that framed the concept or the theme, and then there were activities that you could do within each of those. And I'm just going to show you one of the videos to give you a sense of, I don't know, I'm not online. Bummer. Okay, I'm not going to show you a video, but the videos are on YouTube. You can see them on your own. But yeah.
Can I ask a question? I'm sorry for the last, Dan. But can you define what makes something a game and not just an interactive activity?
Sure. No, it's a good question, and the game dynamics in this were relatively light. Essentially what we did was we created the game dynamics developed around the competition, and the competition was actually quite meaningful, and it was simply around point acquisition. So getting points was it was an incredibly meaningful component for a lot of people, and the leaderboard, which is actually the leaderboard. It's not any screenshots, sorry. The leaderboard was typically, in most cases, around here, and people were able to essentially find people in that leaderboard, but then also, again, as I said before, one of the strategic moves was pooling points. So people would pool points with other people within affiliations. And so we saw a lot of that happening. And people did say that, in fact, one of the motivators of playing was getting points and earning tokens. So the game really came from that. So yes, in a lot of ways it was I don't like the term, but it's sort of a gamification of an interactive experience. But But what we did find, though, that because the missions wrapped around particular themes, that it was actually, people did think about each of the missions as sort of cohesive entities, in the sense that they were able to break up their sense of participation in the system through this idea of missions, like they had an accomplishment. And one of the things that you can do in a game, what you can do with games is create, you can create sort of intermittent accomplishments through the course of any kind of interactive experience. So it is a challenging term because it doesn't look like you don't have an avatar that you're running through an environment, right? So that's sort of what we typically would experience with games. And again, as I mentioned before, the last game that I did, Participatory Chinatown, did look like that. So and one of the reasons why we decided to do a game like that's more text-based, essentially, is because we wanted something lighter that was a platform. So what we had to give up in terms of game dynamics to create a platform that could be used in any context or in any city was some of that sort of immersive experience. So one of the things that the system did as well is that after you responded, it wasn't until after you responded that you were able to see what other people said. So another thing that people said is that it was actually in the another motivator was they wanted to put in their response so that they could see the visualization of other people's responses. And it was actually a big deal for a lot of people, sort of keeping that away from people until they went through the process. And again, it was a barrier that we put up, and because people did see this as framed like a game, they were more willing to accept the kind of the rules that we put on it, right? So one of the things that happens in a game is that you go along with the rule structure. It's a what some call the magic circle. So you enter into this magic circle and you sort of buy into it. Like, okay, I'm going to buy into the rules of Monopoly, or I'm going to buy into the rules of baseball, even though I know that if I really wanted to, run to second base, I could just do it. I don't have to hit the ball first. But buying into the rules is part of that process, and you can do a little bit more of that when you call something a game. So at the end of the whole process, we had an end of game meeting, and one of my favorite interview quotes was someone saying this was the most civil BPS meeting I've ever attended. And the civility was really interesting. And I mean, we don't have time to go into all of why that might have happened, but I would surmise to say that it was partly because there were, again, rules placed on a meeting. And people went into a meeting with this sort of, almost this fictional narrative that was placed on the meeting, which is Community PlanIt, and it did create a remarkably civil experience. The other thing that happened in the meeting is that people wore name tags that represented their avatar name, which was their first name and last initial within the game. And there was a kind of minor celebrity that took place within the course of the meetings as well, when people recognized players within the game. In one case, there was actually applause in the room. So there was so there was something that was meaningful about status within the system that was set up. So in the case of the meeting, 65 people attended this meeting, and the structure was small groups solve problems as characters in the community. So we took the characters that were introduced within the course of the game, and we gave them to people that attended the meeting as a way, and we asked them to use those characters to solve problems that were given to them. So essentially, we broke up the meeting into small groups, and everything was facilitated by the youth. So we had a small cohort of what we call technology interpreters, which was the group of students that actually came from English high school, and they were both important for modeling play within the game. So they were the ones who were uploading most videos, sort of modeling good use of the system. They were recruiting their friends, and they were recruiting other people. They actually had a really important role to play in just again getting people involved and getting people interested. And then they also became subject experts. And at the end, in this at the meeting, they were there and facilitating facilitating these small groups, and they became a really important part of the civility that was created. One theory we have about the civility is that simply by having youth present not in a subservient role, but actually in a moderator role, in a facilitator role, got people to behave in a very different way when they were at that meeting. And actually, we know this to be true. Several people said during the actual game, and I think I have, one person said, knowing that students were online made me take real care in my responses because I felt I had to model good grammar and create thoughtful responses. So, so the presence of youth for the adults was actually really important, both online and off, and it was a really important dynamic. This image here is this is the sort of core group of youth that we had that we were able to present to the superintendent at the end of the process. It was really meaningful stuff. And this is the superintendent right there on the right. Okay, so a strong cohort of engaged youth, as I said, technology interpreters, set the standard for participation. That mutual responsibility, as I mentioned before, I think is really important in the way that the system worked. And then opportunities to sustain networks beyond the game. And so that was an important piece too. The idea of this, because it ends, because it has a very particular arc, is that the goal is to take those networks that were created during this process and then extend them outside. And having the youth involved was really important for the possibility of that. Just quickly, I mean, this is just give you some rough idea. So over 400 users signed up. Interestingly, only 260 were active users, meaning over 100 points. So a lot of how we looked at it was looking at the active users. So the active users, 40% were students, 25 parents, and 17% teachers and administrators. 58% female, 30% male. The others just didn't state. And then 34% white, 27% African American, and 19% Hispanic. And then we had some other breakdown as well, but those are the main ones. So it gives you a sense of the demographics of our players. Yeah.
17% were teachers and administrators, but how much of that 17% was actually administrators? Was it like 3% or?
No, it was actually high. It was most of it. It was about 10%. So we had a lot of administrators playing. We're going to hear from one of them, actually, who can talk more about what the culture was like within the central office.
More central office people than like principals and school-based.
Yeah, right. So yeah, there was a lot of curiosity within the central office. So I know we're kind of running short on time, so let me just go through this here. The other thing I wanted to point out was the token spending, how people spent their tokens. So this, I don't know if you can see this, but essentially this is how the values broke down within the system. The two that I want to point here, so let me just go over them. Opportunities to learn, family and community engagement, growth, proficiency, achievement gaps, attendance, school environment and safety. So these were the values that we set up for people, and this was actually, this was the school performance index. This is essentially the categories from the index. And we asked people to spend their tokens on these things. What we found is that the only one that's not within the school performance index, and I'm gonna ask Carl to speak about this a little bit more, maybe if this is important to talk about, was the opportunities to learn, but that's where we got most of our token spending. It was a value that was expressed overwhelmingly. And then within the school performance index, family and community engagement received 130 tokens, which was which I want to point out, and this is what we've been talking about. It actually sort of reinforced the process that had taken place before Community PlanIt. So one of the important outcomes of Community PlanIt was to get a wider sample to essentially to validate the suspicions that had already been in place, which was the community values towards family and community engagement. Okay, so this is what we learned. We learned that mission-based format, it focused online efforts, that essentially this level of curation is potentially very powerful for this kind of engagement effort. The presence of youth was absolutely necessary, and you know, I would never do a process like this without youth, which is really interesting because when we set out to do this, we didn't plan from the very beginning to engage youth as heavily as we did. and we ended up engaging them quite extensively, and it shaped the use remarkably, in a remarkable way. Level of civility was high, as I mentioned before, and it was part of the sort of stepping into the game phenomenon that we noticed, both online and off. And there were problems in messaging, and the problems were the game had design flaws, and this is it led to a disconnect between registration and active play. So there was that number that I showed you, the 400 registered users, 260 active users. That's something that is a real problem, and in our redesign we hope to address that. And I think one of the problems is that the experience wasn't directed enough. So it was what the thing wasn't as clear as it needed to be. So you ask people to engage and they get into this software, and then taking them from that initial sort of I'm agreeing to do this to actually spending time doing this is something that we have since considered in our design. And then the association with the school district could have been more precise. And what I mean by this, and this is something that we can talk about, is sort of the politics of using something like this. And I think Carl and maybe Chris will address this. There wasn't a presence for this on the homepage of the BPS's homepage, for instance. And part of it was there was a kind of risk-averse quality to BPS's engagement, which I understand, but it's not useful in doing a system like this. There needed to be complete ownership of the system in order to get its maximum use. And it's not just as a means of marketing, but it's actually about confidence building. Because one thing that people said was that they lost confidence in the system because they talked to friends who had never heard of it. And how can you expect to have a process that works if just simply awareness isn't at something close to universal? So just a couple lessons. And so quickly, we're going to focus our attention on BPS, but we're launching the system in Detroit as part of the master planning in that city, and in Quincy in early May. And then we're in discussion with BPS to launch another game around the school choice process. So this is where the platform is going, and I just want to show you some quick updates in what the platform looks like. One of the things that is happening now in the redesign is that when you come to Community PlanIt, there's a game state and a non-game state. So when a game is not active, there's a place essentially for you to interact with the community and for you to interact with other things, other resources that are important. So this is what the homepage of Community PlanIt will look like. And each city that uses Community PlanIt will have a city page. And essentially what happens is when you sign up for a game, it tells you here that the game launches long-term planning in Detroit starts in 3 days. So it tells you exactly when it's going to launch. But here you have all the games that are going on in the city of Detroit. It tells you when they're going to launch. And it gives you, once you log in, it gives you access to, this isn't going to look exactly like that, but it gives you access to your profile, and then it allows you to access resources, so PDFs or images or videos that the planners put up. It also allows you to create a get-together, so essentially a meetup that you could do within the system. And then it also allows you to find other players within the Community PlanIt logic. And it gives you, it's the home base for the city, essentially. The game is going to look something like this, which, now the idea is that when you first come in, what you're working towards is the map of the future, what you see up there. Instead of getting no tokens, which was what the first system, the logic of the first system, in this case, when you first come into the system, you're given 5 what we're now calling planning pegs. You're given 5 planning pegs that you put on this map to the future, and it's a priority map essentially. And then every time you complete a mission, which is a progress bar up on top, every time you can complete a mission, you get another peg. So the concept is if there's 5 missions, you can get a total of 10 pegs, but each person who plays, even if they don't play extensively, gets to participate within this map, and it's a very directed experience. And then as the other things here, you get badges within the systems. You get badges for answering trivia questions. You can become a local historian. You can get a local historian badge, rather. You can get, there's one badge called a crowdsourcer. If you create a lot of get-togethers, you get a crowdsourcer badge. Steve blanking on other badges. What are some of our other badges?
Well, local sage, I think. Well, I think that was for you.
Right, local sage is another one. So anyway, the concept is that through certain functions within the game, you can earn badges as well as points. So you have your progress on a number of levels, and up there you see where you are in the case of you're in the third mission about public spaces up there. So again, the game looks something like this, and what I want to show you is here's an example of typing in your response to a prompt here, and you don't see anything, and it says, it's very small here, but it says once you have responded, you'll be able to view everyone's answers, and this would be an example of what a multiple choice response would look like, and it takes you to something like this, which is it gives you a representation of how everyone answered, and then it also gives you everyone's answers down here that you can interact with, and then there's a kind of heat map to essentially the popularity of responses. So trying to get over one of the problems we had with the original Community PlanIt is we had, you have 150 responses to something, it becomes really meaningless really fast. In this case, you can just look over it. It's not the most popular don't rise to the top, but they just change colors. It's a little bit more engaging with the 3 columns so that your eyes can move over it and then use your way. So it's one solution to the too much data problem. In the city of Detroit, the target user base is going to be 5,000. I don't know if we'll get that, but if we get that many users, we're going to get a huge amount of data. So one of the problems with a system like this. And that's all I want to say for now. And I think but Carl's coming up to talk about the VPS experience. Right?
Chris, thank you.
Yeah.
Fascinating. We may as well leave it on, because I suspect at some point we're going to want to look back at something you put up there.
Oh, okay.
Oh, there we go. So, Carl.
Yes.
Carl Allen, Kennedy School graduate, now working through Boston Public Schools. I don't know if this was your idea or it fell on your desk. Presumably you wound up in this interesting position of saying, I think we ought to be playing a game to work on developing school evaluation standards. How did that work out for you?
Yeah, well, so I was working on this school performance index project as a member of the Office of Accountability, and so that was kind of my project, and I was also in charge of sort of devising some strategies for engaging with the community about the project, getting input from the community, and so we also started to pursue standard traditional channels that the VPS uses to engage, meeting with parents, go via parent site council meetings and going to ESL classes that are taught at some schools, and just through a variety of channels, face-to-face meetings. But I actually met Eric at a meetup organized by a friend of mine, a former spouse of a Kennedy School grad that I was friends with, and met Chris and Nigel, and met Eric at kind of an urban planner meetup sort of thing, and saw Eric present this Community PlanIt solution, and then was real intrigued and kind of approached the city about it, and it kind of went from there. So yeah, I was really excited to be involved, and I was sort of leading the effort from the VPS standpoint. We were treating it as, part of the way I was able to sell it to VPS to try this new innovative thing was that, okay, this is a pilot, and we're going to see how this goes, and it is going to be sort of limited in scope. But we did run into some problems, as Eric mentioned, with just this sort of lack of ownership and buy-in and perception from people that were playing the game that this wasn't officially endorsed by VPS. But the fact that it wasn't was kind of the only way I was able to do it. So that was a little bit of a bind there. But I believe that from our perspective, it was great. People were really impressed. I think it turned a lot of heads in VPS, and both in the parent community, the leaders in the various parent groups, our Office of Family and Student Engagement, the superintendent. It's had and will continue to have a big impact on this, how the particular project we were engaging about, the School Performance Index, it's having a big impact on that project, which is ongoing. And I think that I think that it eventually will be used for the school of choice process. But now, as Eric is learning, and I'm learning, when these things are officially endorsed and do kind of become as part of the processes that going into a major project like this, redoing student assignment, it's moving a little bit slow, but I think it's going to happen, and that's going to be huge. That's going to be huge. So I'm excited about it.
So you said that it affected this sort of school performance index. Could you give a sort of specific example of a way that it surfaced?
Yeah.
Either a set of preferences or a set of issues that might not have otherwise, or was it just a different set of actors?
No, so one way was just a very much, the most obvious way is through this voting that Eric showed, the token depot where people voted on the various priorities that made up our index. He said that, these opportunities to learn, which we defined within the game and define when we talk about this broad school accountability framework that we're designing, that's going to be a sort of separate index which measures more the inputs, the opportunities to learn, the courses, the facilities, and these kind of things which we're not necessarily holding schools accountable for, but rather those things which, we want to hold the district and schools mutually accountable for providing in schools kind of the necessary conditions to succeed. The other elements are part of the school performance index, which we are defining as things which the schools are largely under the school's purview. These are the outcomes. These are student achievement, attendance, and family student engagement was one of those, student growth, and school environment and safety. So we had entered into this process with a set of kind of weights and metrics and how we might measure these things, and then how we would sort of weigh those things together to come up with a performance index. Then we would kind of put all the schools next to each other and see how they rank up. And through both our face-to-face process and through Community PlanIt, Community PlanIt ended up really reinforcing some of what we heard even with our limited face-to-face process, which was that people wanted to put a lot more weight on things like attendance, family student engagement and safety in particular, which family student engagement, school environment and safety, and then attendance, which were actually the three least prevalent things on kind of the initial weightings and how we proposed it. And then we also learned that one of the new things, which we thought we were being very progressive on, was we wanted to stress academic growth in the state's SGP, student growth percentiles, a way of measuring student progress on state tests relative to peer groups from one test to another. So it's kind of it's like a value-added model, sort of measuring growth against expectation, rather than just sort of proficiency, which measures kind of where a student ends up, but it doesn't factor in where they started, right? So we wanted to put an emphasis on those growth measures, but what we found was, and so we had those heavily weighted, we found that people didn't really understand them, and that, this was an important process for helping us to learn how to talk about them and how people understood them, but also recognizing that we couldn't really put so much weight on such measures that people had so little confidence in and didn't understand. And so that led us to, I think that we need to do a lot more community process around, a lot more education around these measures, and also rethinking how things are weighted. So those are two big ways that this project can be definitely effective.
Go to clarifying question.
Yeah. How about the huge, massive other content generated? So the many comments. Having seen this a little bit before, my school blocks YouTube, et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah.
Any other thing. Something like, how to weight these things. Just to play devil's advocate, could have been done with a Survey Monkey survey of everybody.
Sure.
This. But so there's so much more that you got out of it. And then, because what I was thinking when Eric was talking about games was that I get bored by games because I think they're not real, and so I don't want to play them. And so, what makes what do you do with all the other info you got?
Well, one thing that was neat was that there are a couple things. One thing was great, I think, is that there was some real-time feedback. I was in the game, a bunch of other administrators were in the game, just immediately responding and then engaging with people on these questions, and that was cool. I think that lended some real validity to the process, right, where people just didn't feel like their stuff was, they were putting dots on a board and it was going to go in some storage room somewhere. They were actually getting immediate responses to things. We did also put up some sort of a limited set of more official responses after the fact, where I kind of cherry-picked a few issues that I thought certain administrators ought to perhaps respond to. I collected those comments and kind of sent them on to our director of information technology with the district to respond to the social media issues, for instance. I think, and so some of those, a limited set of those responses were kind of posted as like this official response. But I also think, they're still there, and the responses on the system. We've created this archive, this record, this public record, which we've never had at BPS really. When I was looking to see past results of past engagements, whether it be on past student assignment process engagements or other things, we don't keep those records very well. They're not readily accessible to the public. And the kind of analysis that Eric's doing, the kind of analysis we have, we had an intern helping me out with a lot of the coding of the qualitative data. The types of stuff that we're doing there is really a new level for BPS in terms of trying to process all this data. It is a lot, and there's a ton there that we haven't gotten to, but I'm confident that we're getting to a lot more in the conversation, a lot more depth and a lot more responsiveness, and there was a lot more learning on the part of the district than what's ever happened in any other process.
I just want to say also to that this is why I think it's really important to distinguish between a planning tool and an engagement tool. And as a planning tool, there are these hurdles, which is what do we do with all of this input, all this information. As an engagement tool, we did see that the process of the process of being a part of this was actually meaningful for people, and that's something that planners, whether it's at a school level or at a city level, should care about. It's essentially the pretense of planning. Like, I want to get information from the community, and it's using that as a way of bolstering the community and creating a meaningful sense of advocacy within the community. So I think it worked on that level. And I also want to say that the social media thing was fascinating, in that one of the biggest issues that came out of a user-generated challenge actually was the fact that BPS blocked YouTube within the schools, and so when the youth were trying to upload videos within schools, they couldn't. So it was this really interesting thing where it was like they were getting from the district, hey, use Community PlanIt, it's really meaningful for you to be a part of, and they tried to use it and they couldn't, and then they started responding back into the system like, you're not letting us use it, what's up with our social media policy? And that became a really meaningful conversation. I mean, not just amongst the students, but everybody started talking about the social media policy. So it's kind of meta, but it was actually really important for that conversation to happen.
Yeah, yeah. And it succeeded in elevating the conversation, which our information officer wanted to do at the superintendent level. It put it on her radar all of a sudden, and the chief information officer was like, yeah, can we revisit this policy? Because look what's happening. And the superintendent was like, oh. So that was cool.
Social media isn't all lolcats. Like, you could actually,
So I think it's had a lot of little impacts like that. Yeah, I think it's big.
I want to bring Chris on the conversation. Chris Osgood, as I mentioned, is the co-director of the Office of New Urban Mechanics in Boston, which is in and of itself a pretty interesting entity. And you're trying to do a whole variety of experiments with different kinds of platforms. And I'm wondering what you took out of this in terms of both what's possible, what's difficult, and what's not possible.
Right. So for those of you who don't know, the Mayor's Office of New Urban Mechanics is essentially an office, an innovation incubator that exists inside of Mayor Muno's office in Boston. We were formed about 2.5 years ago with, as David said, sort of this mandate to run experiments that can actually point new directions for delivering services in areas like education or neighborhood quality of life or participatory urbanism. We worked with outside entrepreneurs like Eric and inside entrepreneurs like Carl on a bunch of our projects, and this is one we were very pleased to support. I guess sort of to get into what we kind of learned from this process and why I think Community PlanIt is so exciting. Most of the efforts by municipal innovation offices, both in this nation and around the world, focus on a pretty narrow slice of innovation. It's mainly about exchanging information between city residents and city governments. This has led to things that are really useful and valuable, things like real-time transit apps, which are great for your buses, or 311 reporting apps that allow you to report graffiti or potholes quicker to government. They're great things, they've had terrific impact, but if you ask anybody outside right now, what the number one issue for them is, it's not where their bus is, it's not the pothole in front of their house, it's things like education policy or job policy or public health policy. And so, in order to get those sort of bigger issues, we think that it's not just about exchange of information between city residents and city government, but as Eric was saying, it's really about engagement, about deliberation. And how do we actually create new models for engaging our residents in sort of a deliberative process? And as we were sort of talking about the difference from going from kind of that information exchange to a deliberative model, we're talking about the difference between the actual process of fixing a pothole and the process of fixing a policy. And I kind of just want to walk through just that parallel as a way of teasing out David's question, what some of the things are that I think are really exciting about Community PlanIt and the direction we need to go, and the sort of areas for analysis that we have in front of us. So to fix a pothole, it's really simple. You simply pick up the phone and call your local municipality or use a smartphone app if there is one. The city takes the address, gets routed to the right person to fix, the pothole gets filled, and if you provide your contact information, it's likely you get some sort of email response that says, thank you so much for reporting a pothole, that pothole is now fixed. So there's this process of outreach where you're making the call, this moment of process where the city is actually figuring out how to fill this pothole, and then this feedback loop where you get this email response. And I think across all three of those dimensions, there's some interesting differences. So starting with the feedback, which is essentially was your question, there's no way we can repurpose that email that says thank you for calling about a pothole, that pothole is now fixed, for something like a community meeting. We can't send out an email that says thank you so much for coming to that community meeting, that policy is now fixed. Because your first question is like, well, what did you do? Like, what is the new policy, and how did my feedback actually impact what you decided? Even if you don't see any of your specific feedback in that new policy, how did it shape the conversation or shape the deliberation? And so I think one of the major sort of really interesting areas that we're interested in exploring in neuromechanics, with these things, with these deliberative platforms, how do we actually think about the new models of providing really good feedback to residents so that those 4,600 comments are actually well responded to? Now, 4,600 comments is an insane amount for Carl to actually have to take on. So what is the right way to make sure that we are really engaging people and saying, hey, we listened to you and your voice had an impact and here's how it had an impact, without providing a completely unreasonable burden on the city to provide. So I think it's a pretty interesting area for us to dive into, and one that Community PlanIt is helping us do. The second area is this sort of this process question. So fixing a pothole is really about our public works department sort of dispatching folks to the right place. And those tend to be a very private process. Deliberation is a very public process. And this is to Eric's essentially answer to your question. I think one of the really cool things about platforms like Community PlanIt and about the work that we want to do in this area is how do you take advantage of the fact that there is this interplay between the players themselves that doesn't exist when you're reporting a pothole or checking where your bus is. And that part of the real value of deliberative platforms, about engagement platforms, and not just planning platforms or kind of idea crowdsourcing platforms, is you have this opportunity to actually build empathy or understanding across the participants. Not to build consensus, but to actually help people understand the varieties of opinions that are out there and why those opinions are out there. And then the third piece, which is one that Dan O'Brien in the second row is sort of working with us on right now, more on the pothole side, but potentially also on the policy side. We've noticed in the city of Boston that the channel of outreach, the way that people connect the city government, whether they call us on the phone, they use our website, they use the smartphone app, actually dictates in some degree, like the type of response that we get, what they're reporting, where they might be reporting, how frequently they may be reporting. And I think these are all kind of really fascinating things to deal with on these sort of platforms. How do we shape platforms? How do we shape platforms that are going to engage more folks? And then how do we understand how those platforms themselves are shaping the types of responses that we get for good or bad? How do we consider that, and we balance that across the range of feedback we get, whether it's an in-person community meeting, an online platform, or some other process. So I mean, there's a huge number of sort of great substantive areas that basically the work of Carl and Eric has allowed us to sort of start the path of going down. And I think it's really the future for municipal innovation in the years ahead.
So one of the advantages of a small crowd is the ability to, I think, engage in a little bit more conversation and not so I encourage you to share questions, even observations. If you've watched Rappaport events over the years, that's something I almost never ask you to do. But I think given who's here and you're interested in this, I would ask that you do identify yourself, and whether you're asking a question or making an observation, you keep it relatively succinct. So, questions, comments, thoughts? This is a really interesting new model, it seems to me. Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, hello. This is the first time I'm actually coming to this series of talks. I'm a student of Graduate School of Design, and I'm a master's post-professional student there in a program which is concentration in art design in the public domain. And I'm actually from India, and I've been working in participatory design practice. And what is my question is that how do you ensure, as in, what is the compelling factor which helps students to participate in this? What is the incentive, instead of just getting like virtual points? Because I feel that platforms are there, but there has to be a strong force which kind of pulls a person to participate. So if you could, say that if the mechanism of incentive becomes better, if these numbers become from 400 to 600, and are you working on those plans?
I would say the initial answer to that is, and what makes engagement games in a way easier to design than a other sort of self-contained game, is that the incentive to participate already exists. That there are already drivers of participation, interest, need, in some cases. The premise here is that people want to participate, and they're interested in learning about what's happening in the school, what's happening in their neighborhood, whatever it might be. Providing a friendly, somewhat engaging, and even fun way of participating is just taking that existing driver, which is desire and need, and then bringing that into something that we can call engagement. So the simple answer is that it's already there. The more complicated answer is that sometimes youth need convincing that they should be interested, right? So there's that other layer, and in that case, it's more difficult. And regardless of how engaging it is, it's going to be difficult to get perhaps to get youth interested in something like school planning, as an example. What we found was that by working with really talented teachers, that we were able to get the students really interested. And at first, it took some convincing at our core group of students, and this was the model. We had a core group of students. It took some convincing for them to be interested in it. They got obsessed with it, and they were constant users of the system. They got other people. They would go out and get other people to be involved in it, and they weren't totally self-motivated, but they were at the end, and that was the amazing process. So the answer then is you have to create infrastructure around young people's use of this, and it's more than just flipping on a switch, turning something on, and hoping that people interact. There's actually, we did a lot of boots on the ground kind of outreach to get people interested in this process. So,
Eric, just to clarify, because you started by saying getting really great teachers involved.
Yeah.
And then you talked about that you engage students, and I'm wondering, when you said teachers, did you mean BPS teachers, or did you mean the students? So how did you get the teachers involved?
We found really it was one teacher actually that the way that this worked was that a teacher named Xavier Rojas over at English High, incredibly talented media teacher that worked with some students in an after-school program, and that became our core cohort. He did it just for fun, there was no other reason for him to do it except that he cared about it.
And then did you have the same quality of him then bringing in other teachers?
Well, no. Actually, what happened was he brought in this core group of students, and the students brought in other students. So it was one teacher, a group of about 6 or 7 committed students, And then that grew over time, over the course of 55 days.
And just your question prompted, if somebody signed up for this, kind of what was the minimum amount of time you would have to spend on it to kind of answer? I can imagine somebody, there were probably some people who spent hours on this,
Yes.
but let's say I was a parent who got interested, like how long, you know, on a night or a week would you anticipate?
People spent about, most people spent about 15 minutes to half an hour.
A night or a week?
At each sitting.
At each
So
sitting.
in some cases they would sit for, you know, they would do it once a week. Sometimes they would do it 3 times a week. We had 7% of our users were super users. They were on a lot, and those were kind of evenly divided between students and adults, or youth and adults. But the majority of the users, the majority of our active users earned about 600 points, and so that's about, you know, it was typically about 25 points per activity. So, you know, 24 activities over the course of the whole thing. So it wasn't like, this wasn't a huge time commitment for people, and that's one of the things that people liked about it, that it wasn't a huge time commitment. One of the things that we did learn actually is that it was, the way that this one was built that we're going to change is that every single activity that you did within the system, even if it was plotting a point on a map, required you to write a response as to why you did it. And we thought that was a really good idea, and it actually was sort of a good idea, but some people complained that it was just too much commitment. And sometimes when they were deciding whether or not to log on, they said, well, I don't really have the time, you know? And so, so now in the new system, there's clearly delineated question types and points. So for something that doesn't require any kind of text input, it's 10 points. For something that does require text input, it's 25 points. So you can sit down and decide how much you want to be involved at any given time. So that's really important. We want to be able to get people for a minute. You know, if you've got a minute between meetings, if you have a few minutes at night, we want people in those tiny interstitial moments in their lives you know, as Clay Shirky talks about, it's like cognitive surplus. We've got all this surplus of time for people. We pull a few minutes from each person, we can have something amazing in our cities. And so that's kind of what we're trying to get.
I want to say quickly to your point about the incentive too. I think, you know, Eric mentioned that there is this sort of natural incentive, but I think just the accessibility, and even if there were no new incentives, all of a sudden you've created a process that's open to people at 10 o'clock at night. It's open to people on a Saturday, that's open to people in their home, and that's also sort of more accessible to students or to people who don't want to go and speak publicly. So there's a lot of new sort of vehicles for accessibility that just, absent any new incentives, you know, if the thing is publicized correctly, it's more accessible to many folks.
Just to follow up, as in, could the incentive be that the change is going to be made? My problem is going to be looked, you know, this is this also, you know, were they hoping that, like what you said, that feedback thing, are the people actually hoping that it's going to be, you know, it's going to make a difference? Because, and as planning processes are like long term, it takes long time.
I think that's what underpins why both Eric and Carl spoke about sort of the legit, like EPS, or legitimizing that platform or sort of endorsing the platform, because that allows them to say, I have sort of, as Eric was saying, I have this need to actually share some thoughts about this issue. Carl was saying this platform is accessible, and with BPS sort of saying, and we will pay attention to what you're saying, and that will shape the school performance index, that then makes me feel like, oh, okay, it's worth it for me to express myself on this topic.
And the onus is still on us as we continue with this project. I mean, we're still analyzing those 46,000 comments, and we're still moving forward with the project to show that we've incorporated the feedback and that we listened. And then if we use the platform again, that'll also show that we listened in terms of people's feedback, that they like that, and they like the process. And so.
And I think it is a design challenge to, you need to honestly communicate the act of being listened to, you know, and to do that in software is a challenge. And I say honestly because you can communicate being listened to when no one's listening, right? So I think that's the real challenge and the responsibility that the organization has who's sponsoring this thing. And this is what's so interesting, whether we're working with the city or a school district, to commit to, especially with something new, to commit to say, yeah, we'll take responsibility for whatever happens here. I mean, it's a real problem. I mean, even on a smaller scale, I've done projects with, with architects, and the problem with community input is that it's community input. It's designed by a committee, and designers don't like that, and policymakers. It's hard for policymakers. It's hard for everybody. So, and yet we know it's a better process. We know it's better for it's better for communities. It engages people in more meaningful ways. We know we need to do it, but for the organizations that have to do it, it's a huge amount of responsibility.
You could also identify yourself.
Yeah, I'm a professor at UCSD. I used to work at the Harvard Ed School. I'm wondering if the thought experiment super quick about the limits of how engaged BPS really is ready for people to be, in that you can imagine the tool, you can imagine the tool saying, instead of meet up online and talk, you could say, we identified the people who all care about this issue, meet up in the real world, and so will meet you there and discuss, or discuss amongst yourselves in the real world, continue this.
That's what it does now.
Oh, it does? Can
Yeah.
you say more about that?
Well, the feature is called Get Together, and I mentioned that briefly
Right, but
before.
it was on online discussion, right?
No. The
Oh,
whole
it's
point.
just
The whole
real
point
life?
is that it's like a meetup. It facilitates a meetup, and what it does is it spits out a code for the person who organizes the get together, and then if you show up, the concept is that if you show up, someone gives you the code, and then you type in the code, and you get your badge for going to the thing. So we try to incorporate the game into these real life events that is meant to do just what you're talking about, which is meant to get people to rally in physical space around.
And so do administrators want to be there and gather?
Well, from the perspective for our first game, we did this final meeting, the final wrap-up or debrief, in which we did have a number of our administrators, the director of our Office of Community Engagement, director of our Office of Family and Student Engagement, the director, or the Chief Accountability Officer, myself, a number of folks from my staff, or the staff of that office, rather, who were really, who wanted to meet the players, who wanted to, I think it facilitated it created this entry from central office people to see, okay, who are these people who've been saying these things? Also a sense that we needed to be there to respond to all of this stuff. And I think also something that I'm learning in my new role in the Director of Transportation, dealing with parent calls and lots of issues, things that many of which are out of my control, and I think which the district needs to do better at is just acknowledging complexity, acknowledging that, yes, being realistic, like, wow, we've got a lot of great feedback, we're going to try to go through this earnestly, and saying that to people, and they believe you, and that's satisfying to people. I got in front of that group and I was like, someone came to me, they said, well, I really appreciate you said that. I said, we could tell you that we read the comments and then not read the comments and you wouldn't know. But I'm telling you, this is my job, and my boss is next to me nodding, yes, this is his job, to figure out a way to process all these comments, and I'm going to do my best to kind of, we're going to give an analysis back to you, and we're going to show you how we've listened, and people appreciate that, we need to do better at that as a district. We need to do better at when people are, we can't fix every problem, but we can apologize and we can acknowledge, and I don't know, people appreciate this kind of honesty and ownership, and so even just taking all the feedback and collecting it and sort of earnestly going about finding ways to dive into it and get some things out of it is a huge step forward.
All the way in the back. Yeah.
I'm Leslie Lehman. I'm taking classes at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. One of them is non-gamings and simulations in education. And I'm wondering about the super, you call them the super users. I mean, in every community, we know at community planning board meetings, the person who repeatedly comes to the mic and sort of takes over the meeting. And I'm wondering whether the super users who've earned however many hundreds of points then have a lot more power in the play of what is the game part.
So interestingly, the super users in the regular planning process where we typically call them community activists, right? They are not the super users, or at least they were not the super users in community planning. So we're dealing with two different groups of people. So that's interesting in and of itself. So we're giving other people an opportunity to be super users. And because that's one of the problems with community meetings, the same people are the ones that have the loudest voice.
So just very quickly, how do you know that those aren't the same people?
Because we talk to them.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. I just wanted to.
Yeah.
It makes sense. I mean, the demographic of the
Yeah.
person who would communicate online is different than the person who might
Right.
actually.
I found
So-
that, I would just say quickly, I found that in some of the, initially, we were doing outreach. The people that were initially very interested were those same super users. But then I found in the game that they didn't actually persist.
So the people who were interested were sort of the classic community.
Yeah, like when I was out there talking to a parent meeting and introducing it to them, they were the ones talking, asking questions, and I'll get my people on this. And then they would sign up, and then they weren't active users.
But this is what's interesting about doing this in the first place. We're not talking about, or at least we shouldn't be talking about, replacing the face-to-face engagement that we do in communities. When you do something like this, you're actually engaging, in most cases, a very different population of people. So we're getting a more diverse group of people participating, and that's a good thing. You also get people who want to participate in different ways. Some people are less comfortable speaking. We see this in a classroom context. I've done some work in creating tools for classrooms, and it's been very clear that the people who participate in back channel conversations in the work that I've done are typically the introverts are more comfortable in a text-based situation than the extroverts who are more comfortable speaking in a classroom environment. Having both channels available to people is actually a good thing, and I think that's true in a community as well. That having these sort of parallel channels is just a better thing. Finding ways for them to connect is what needs to happen, so that the super users offline don't get upset that the super users online have too loud of a voice or vice versa.
But even within the user group, within the online community, was there a sense that then what you responded to or the comments, did you feel more pressure to respond to somebody who had earned more badges and points and had been engaged more? Was there more power to the person who had commented or spent 15 minutes every day?
I think with regard to the comments, I'll just say, when we're mining the comments and coding and such, there's no, besides the fact that we're just mining more of those people's comments, we're not looking at the points and values, behind the comments. It also happened to be that those who got more points probably answered more longer, thoughtful responses in general, so there's more opportunities for their content to be mined and listened to. Of course, with the token voting, that directly related to the
That's
level
what I meant.
of
I guess it's the token, then I'm not communicating incorrectly.
It looked
It's
like,
the token
part of
voting.
the game, people could do a kind of like-dislike on the,
Yep.
on the comments.
So that happened as well, but I do want to say that there was in talking to, doing some of the interviews we did with the youth, one of the interesting things that came out is that, as I mentioned before, some of the adults said that the presence of youth was really important. Well, the youth said that the presence of these super users was really important. And they said that it was interesting because several of them commented on the experience of having one of those super users comment on one of their replies. And it was really scary for them, but they felt compelled to address it. They felt compelled to respond back. So that's really interesting that you have young people that are in a situation where they get to respond on equal footing to the adults in this conversation. And in fact, and it wasn't just any adult, it was when specific adults who were the leaders, the super users, would respond to them, they felt, they got more anxious and more excited about the whole process. So there was a power dynamic there, but I don't think it was an entirely bad one.
Sorry, I just want to thank you. My name is Bubba Pearson, and I didn't want to leave without telling you that you've got an ingenious idea. I wish you the best of luck.
Thank you.
Thank you, sir. Why don't we take these two more questions?
Well, that was a really nice way to end it.
This is sort of the code.
I don't want to interrupt it.
Actually, why don't we take both questions at once?
Okay. Well, actually, a comment and a question? Just
Sure.
to have, I keep your question about the super users, and a lot of conversations today is reminding me of Wikipedia and the community that's created there, and how there's a natural, I don't even want to call it a hierarchy of respect. There are people who do put a lot of time into it, and they earn cred, they earn status, and I think that's different from imposing power. So it's really interesting there. 5,000 questions by yourself. My one I'll ask is, because you started off saying there's an interesting tension between creating a game, because people think game, oh, fun. They don't think game serious. And when you're talking about serious issues, people don't put it in game context. So I'm just wondering, was that tension resolved? Did you find by the end of the experience people could conceive of game and meaningful and important in the same way? Or?
Oh, for the players, yeah. I mean, I think that's what's interesting, is that there's a distinction between the organization and the players. I think most of this is a perception problem from the part of embracing a process. We haven't seen, and it's an interesting question as to, because one of the problems in researching something like this is talking to non-users. You can't find them, right? I mean, I have no idea who didn't use it. Most people, but finding out why people didn't use it is really hard to answer. You know, so it's a challenging question. For our users, there wasn't an issue. So the way that I'm able to address that problem is by looking at the organizations and seeing how the organizations respond to the issue of games. And I'm not alone in this. I mean, there's a long history of applying games to contexts like this, and the issue of games in serious business is one that we're still sort of working out.
Okay, so Dan, the last formal question to Dan. I think the panelists can stay around at least for a few minutes for people who want to engage.
All right, so I have, as she does, 1,000 questions, and as Chris and David can tell you, this data is just making my head spin right now. I'm just wondering what's going on with all these kind of super users and stuff. But I'm going to behave and I'm going to ask a question not related to data. And I think the question is really for Carl. I'm really curious about the culture within BPS, within the actual bureaucracy of BPS, of this ingenious tool. And so obviously it's had some buy-in up in the administrative offices, but I'm really curious, so there you're probably having conversations about it and how it's useful and how to disseminate this information. But has there been any conversation with individual principals or administrators at individual schools asking about the data itself, or about does their school differ from any other school in engagement in some way, or the kinds of things they're talking about?
I don't think we're there yet. I mean, in terms of, we had a concentration of users at one school, especially English High, and that was driven by a teacher, and then it kind of spread via some other student groups, and so there wasn't a lot of it wasn't top down from the principal's office how kids got involved, and so there wasn't as much principal engagement in the tool as I had wanted. I actually did a lot of face-to-face engagements with groups of principals trying to get them excited about it, and I think many were. The few that were most engaged, with the exception of English, were the 3 exam schools, Latin Academy, Latin School, and I think just the culture of those schools in particular, and their principals and the capacity of their staffs, kind of looking for more innovative type things to do. They're putting out list fires on a day-to-day basis. I think capacity is a big issue for principals being able to. Some principals, English being one, express an interest in could we run our own game? Could we run a Community PlanIt type game with our parents and our students, and have missions throughout the year where now we're going to talk about uniforms and now we're going to talk about this and that, and it wasn't that the use of the tool is kind of just not within the realm of possibility for a principal right now. The level of kind of curation and technical support that they would need, they didn't have the resources to be able to do that. But I think that's a really cool sort of thing to think about for the future, that sort of these more smaller community, micro uses, just schools getting a sense of their school climate in real time, and how's the morale, and how are parents feeling, and I think that's really cool potential, and kind of teased some principals with that, and there was interest, but they just weren't able to do that.
Well, to quote our dear departed friend, this is something remarkably ingenious that just is leaving lots of people with lots and lots of questions, but I think also a level of excitement. So I appreciate both what you've done and all three of you taking time, because I know, Eric, I don't know you well. I know these two guys pretty well, and I know how hard they work, and watching your stuff, I'm sure how hard you work. So please join me in thanking our panelists. As I said, I don't think they can stay for 1,000 questions. I think they may be able to stay for a couple. Thank you very much.